1316 serves as the anchor point for a narrative that is less about the romance of the Middle Ages and more about its cold, bureaucratic brutality. A story where the life of a 3-year-old girl named Elizabeth de Badlesmere was codified into a legal transaction that would ripple through the centuries to shape the very bloodline of the British monarchy. It is a tale that begins not with a fairy tale wedding, but with a business contract signed on parchment, the ink drying on a deal that treated a toddler as a strategic asset in the volatile market of feudal alliances. If you have an appetite for the darker, unpolished side of history, for the stories hidden in the dust of chancery rolls and the silence of dungeon keeps, then you have arrived at the right place. So please make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel as we unearth the administrative hardships that forged a dynasty. The year 1316 was a time of immense suffering and instability in England, shadowed by the Great Famine that had turned the fields to mud and the people to desperation. Yet in the high halls of the nobility, the game of power continued uninterrupted. Elizabeth was born into this dichotomy, the daughter of Bartholomew de Badlesmere, a man who had risen through the ranks to become the steward of King Edward II's household, a position that placed him at the nerve center of royal government. Her mother, Margaret de Clare, was a woman of formidable lineage and temperament, a niece of the Earl of Gloucester, accustomed to the exercise of authority. But in the shifting sands of Plantagenet politics, even such powerful connections were no guarantee of safety, and Bartholomew knew that to survive, he needed to bind his house to the other great powers of the realm. Thus, on June 27, 1316, a bewildered 3-year-old Elizabeth was brought to the manor of Ernwood in Kinlet, Shropshire, to be married to Edmund Mortimer, the eldest son of the powerful Roger Mortimer of Wigmore. The groom was himself a child, likely no older than 13, and the ceremony was a grim reflection of the era's priorities, the merging of the Badlesmere influence in the royal household with the military might of the Mortimer lords of the Welsh Marches. The marriage contract, preserved in the dry, formulaic Latin of the period, made no mention of the girl's consent or her future happiness. It was purely a ledger of dower rights, land transfers, and mutual defense obligations. Elizabeth was not yet a person in the eyes of the law. She was a vessel for the transmission of property, a small living seal on a document intended to create a political fortress against the chaos that was consuming the reign of Edward II.
Bartholomew de Badlesmere, initially a staunch royalist who had profited from the king's favor, found himself in an impossible position as the center collapsed. He attempted to navigate a middle path, but in a polarized world, neutrality is often viewed as treason. The tension finally snapped in the autumn of 1321, and it was Elizabeth's mother, Margaret, who struck the match that would ignite the realm. The incident at Leeds Castle is one of those rare moments where a domestic decision alters the course of national history. King Edward II, looking for a pretext to crush the growing baronial opposition, sent his queen, Isabella of France, to demand lodging at the Badlesmere stronghold of Leeds in Kent. Bartholomew was away in the north, leaving Margaret in command. When the royal harbinger arrived to demand entry, Margaret, likely fearing that the queen's entourage was a Trojan horse for the hated dispensers to seize the castle, stood on the drawbridge and refused. She declared that she could not admit anyone without her husband's orders. When the queen's men persisted, the order was given to fire. The archives record that 6 of the royal escort were slain by the castle's archers. This was not just a skirmish, it was a declaration of war. For the 8-year-old Elizabeth, who was inside the walls, the sudden transformation of her home into a battlefield must have been a scene of absolute terror. The king's reaction was swift and furious. He raised an army, utilizing the incident to rally support against the insolence of the Badlesmeres. The siege of Leeds Castle began in late October 1321, and the chronicles describe the relentless bombardment of the fortress by the king's siege engines. The noise of the catapults, the shouting of the soldiers, and the dwindling of supplies would have been Elizabeth's reality for days. Her father, fighting in the north with the rebel barons, could send no help. On October 31, 1321, the castle surrendered. The mercy of the king was non-existent. The castellan, Walter Culpeper, and 12 of the garrison were executed immediately outside the gates, their bodies left as a stark warning. But for the Badlesmere women, a colder, slower punishment was devised. Margaret de Clare and her children, including Elizabeth, were arrested and declared prisoners of the state.
The journey itself, likely undertaken in carts under heavy guard, was a public humiliation, parading the fallen family before the eyes of the realm. Once inside the tower, the reality of administrative cruelty took hold. We know of her life there not through diaries which do not exist, but through the exchequer accounts and the wardrobe rolls that track the pennies spent on her existence. These documents are chilling in their banality. They record the purchase of coarse cloth for dresses, the measured rations of bread and ale, and the fuel allowances for heating the damp stone chambers. Elizabeth was not harmed in the physical sense, but she was subjected to the psychological anguish of total uncertainty. She was a child alone in a prison, separated from her father, watching her mother's despair. The news that filtered through the thick walls was catastrophic. The rebellion led by Thomas of Lancaster had failed. At the Battle of Boroughbridge in March 1322, the rebel army was crushed. Bartholomew de Badlesmere was captured in the aftermath. The king, remembering the insult at Leeds, was implacable. Bartholomew was taken to Canterbury, close to his own estates, to ensure the maximum humiliation of his house. There he was condemned as a traitor. The sentence was carried out with the full, severe theater of medieval justice. He was drawn by horses to the gallows and there executed for his crimes, his remains displayed on the city gate. For Elizabeth, this was the moment the world broke. She was now the daughter of a traitor. The legal mechanism of attainder was triggered, a bureaucratic weapon that was as deadly as a sword. Attainder meant the corruption of the blood. The Badlesmere name was erased from the Book of Honor. All lands, titles, and assets were forfeited to the crown. Elizabeth was left with nothing, no dowry, no inheritance, no future. She was a ward of the king who had ended her father, a penniless girl existing solely on the royal payroll, a line item in a ledger of prisoners. Her husband, Edmund Mortimer, was also in the Tower, his father, Roger Mortimer, having been imprisoned there earlier. The two families, bound by the marriage contract of 1316, were now united in ruin, languishing together in the king's jail. The years from 1322 to 1326 were a period of stasis and fear. Elizabeth grew from a child of 8 to a teenager of 12 within the confines of custody. She lived in the shadow of the dispenser tyranny, the regime of Edward II's favorites who were systematically seizing the estates of their enemies. The administrative records show the redistribution of the Badlesmere lands, the manors that should have been Elizabeth's inheritance now generating income for the men who had executed her father. It was a lesson in the brutal economics of power. Treason was profitable for the victors. Yet the Tower was not a tomb, it was a waiting room. In 1323, a dramatic event occurred that would eventually change Elizabeth's fate. Her father-in-law, Roger Mortimer, managed a spectacular escape from the Tower, drugging the guards and climbing the walls to freedom. He fled to France, leaving his family, including Elizabeth's husband, Edmund, behind to face the king's wrath. But his escape lit a spark of hope. From France, Mortimer began to plot, eventually forming a scandalous and powerful alliance with Queen Isabella, who had turned against her husband. The rumors of their invasion must have reached Elizabeth, whispered by servants or guards, a glimmer of possibility that the cage might one day open. That day came in 1326. Isabella and Mortimer landed in England, and the regime of Edward II collapsed with shocking speed. The king's support evaporated, the dispensers were captured and executed, and Edward II was deposed. For Elizabeth, the revolution was personal. The prison doors were unlocked. Her mother, Margaret, was released. The attainder on the Badlesmere family was reversed. But the most significant change was her position within the new hierarchy. Roger Mortimer was now the true ruler of England, the regent for the young Edward III. As his daughter-in-law, Elizabeth was propelled from the depths of the Tower to the dizzying heights of the court. She was no longer a prisoner, she was royalty in all but name. 1327 to 1330 were the years of the Mortimer ascendancy, a time when Elizabeth lived in the eye of the hurricane. The chancellery rolls from this period tell a story of frantic restitution and greed. Roger Mortimer used his unchecked power to enrich his family and his supporters. The Badlesmere lands were restored, and new grants were showered upon the Mortimers. Elizabeth, now a teenager, was reunited with her husband Edmund. It was during these years that their marriage, contracted in childhood, became a reality. They lived in the household of the dictator, surrounded by the trappings of a power that had been seized through treason and regicide, for Edward II was almost certainly ended in Berkeley Castle in 1327. Elizabeth gave birth to her first son, Roger, in 1328, at the height of this regime.
To the outside observer, she had won. She had survived the fall of her father and risen to be part of the most powerful family in the realm. But the atmosphere of the Mortimer court was toxic. The arrogance of Roger Mortimer alienated the young King Edward III and the other nobles. The administrative cruelty that Elizabeth had suffered was now being inflicted by her own family upon others. The wheel of fortune was spinning wildly, and those who study the records of the time can see the cracks forming in the foundation. The grants were too numerous, the eminence too powerful, the legitimacy too thin. Elizabeth, having seen her father fall for defying a king, must have sensed the danger as her father-in-law defied the young Edward III. The crash came in 1330, and it was as violent and decisive as the one before.
In October, the 18-year-old King Edward III staged a daring coup at Nottingham Castle. Entering through secret tunnels, his men seized Roger Mortimer in his mother's chamber. The dictator was dragged away, his pleas for mercy ignored. He was taken to London and executed at Tyburn, his body left on display for 2 days. Once again, Elizabeth de Badlesmere was on the losing side of history. Her protector was dead, executed as a traitor. Her husband, Edmund, was the son of the usurper. While Edmund was not executed, the shadow of his father's treason destroyed him. He was stripped of the earldom of March and the vast authority the family had accumulated. The stress and the ruin likely contributed to his early death. Edmund Mortimer died in late 1331 or early 1332, leaving Elizabeth a widow at the age of roughly 18 or 19 years old. The situation was dire. She was left with 2 infant sons, Roger and John, and a family name that was radioactive. The crown moved immediately to assert its rights. The wardship of her sons, the right to control their upbringing and their lands, was claimed by the king. The dower lands that were meant to support her were contested. The Inquisition post-mortem from 1332 show the crown's agents carefully cataloging every acre, every tenant, every rent owed to the Mortimers, treating the estate as a carcass to be picked clean. Elizabeth stood on the precipice of oblivion. Many women in her position would have been forced into a nunnery or a disparaging marriage to a minor knight. But Elizabeth possessed the resilience of a survivor. She knew the language of the court, the power of documents, and the necessity of alliances. She began the slow, arduous process of legal rehabilitation.
1335 stands as the testament to her political acumen. Elizabeth understood that to secure her future and that of her sons, she needed to marry a man who was unimpeachable, a man whose loyalty to Edward III was absolute. She found him in William de Bohun. William was a younger son of the Earl of Hereford, a distinguished warrior and a close personal friend of the king. He was one of the architects of the coup that had overthrown Mortimer, which adds a layer of extraordinary complexity to the match. Elizabeth was marrying the man who had helped bring down her father-in-law. It was an unsentimental, pragmatic masterstroke. The marriage required a papal dispensation, as the two were related within the prohibited degrees of consanguinity. The petition to the Pope, preserved in the Vatican registers, is a piece of diplomatic maneuvering, smoothing over the messy political reality with the language of canon law. When the dispensation was granted, the marriage went ahead. The transformation was immediate. As the wife of William de Bohun, Elizabeth was cleansed of the Mortimer stain. In 1337, when Edward III created new titles to bolster his nobility for the coming war with France, William was made Earl of Northampton. Elizabeth de Badlesmere, the girl from the Tower, was now the Countess of Northampton. The chancery rolls began to record a different kind of entry for her: grants of privilege, confirmations of land, and the steady accumulation of wealth. She was back at the center of power, but this time on the side of the victor. The decades that followed, spanning the 1340s and 1350s, reveal Elizabeth as a mature matriarch, a woman who had mastered the administrative machinery that had once enslaved her. With her husband often away fighting in the 100 Years' War, William was a hero of the Battle of Crécy. Elizabeth was the de facto manager of their vast estates. The archival evidence from this period is rich with details of her governance. We see her name on indentures, on appointments of attorneys, and in the records of the manorial courts. She was managing not just the Bohun lands, but also fighting to preserve the inheritance of her Mortimer sons. It is a testament to her influence that her eldest son, Roger Mortimer, was eventually restored to the earldom of March, reclaiming the title his grandfather had lost. This did not happen by accident. It was the result of years of quiet diplomacy and the normalizing influence of her mother's position at court. Elizabeth also bore children with William de Bohun, including a son, Humphrey, and a daughter, Elizabeth. She was weaving a double tapestry of lineage, securing the futures of 2 great houses.
Her life had settled into the rhythm of the high nobility, the travel between manors, the patronage of religious houses, the management of a large and complex household. But she never forgot the lessons of her youth. Her administrative competence was a shield, a way of ensuring that her family would never again be vulnerable to the whims of a king or the stroke of a pen. 1356 marks the final chapter of her life, and the documentation from this year is particularly poignant. In late May, realizing that her health was failing, Elizabeth dictated her last will and testament at her manor in Rochford, Essex. Wills from the 14th century are rare and precious windows into the minds of the people who wrote them. Elizabeth's will is a blend of conventional piety and personal assertion. She directed that her body be buried in the Church of the Black Friars in London. This was a significant choice. The Black Friars was a hub of London's religious and political life, a place of high status and public visibility. By choosing to lie there, she was asserting her place in the capital's spiritual geography. She left bequests to her servants, ensuring they were cared for, and made donations to various religious orders to pray for her soul. It is the final administrative act of a woman whose life had been defined by administration. She died on June 8, 1356. The writs of diem clausit extremis, he has closed his last day, were issued by the Chancery, triggering the Inquisition's post-mortem. These inquests, held in the various counties where she held land, serve as a final inventory of her success. They list manor after manor, rights of pasture, rents, and knights' fees. The list is long and impressive, a far cry from the destitute inventory of the Tower years. But the true magnitude of Elizabeth de Badlesmere's life is not found in the list of her acres, but in the list of her descendants. It is here that the story takes on its most epic dimension, connecting the personal tragedy of 1321 to the national tragedy of the 15th century. The genealogical web that Elizabeth spun is the hidden architecture of the Wars of the Roses. Her progeny from her two marriages ended up on opposite sides of the dynastic struggle that would tear England apart. From her first marriage to Edmund Mortimer, her great-granddaughter was Anne Mortimer. Anne married Richard, Earl of Cambridge, and was the mother of Richard, Duke of York. This makes Elizabeth de Badlesmere the great-great-grandmother of King Edward IV and King Richard III.
The Yorkist claim to the throne was based on their descent from Lionel of Antwerp, but the Mortimer bloodline was the vehicle for that claim. On the other side of the divide, through her second marriage to William de Bohun, her influence was equally profound. Her son, Humphrey de Bohun, the 7th Earl of Hereford, had a daughter named Mary de Bohun. Mary married Henry Bolingbroke, the man who would usurp the throne and become King Henry IV. Mary de Bohun was the mother of King Henry V, the hero of Agincourt. This means that Elizabeth de Badlesmere was the great-grandmother of the greatest Lancastrian king. When Henry V faced the French at Agincourt, and when Richard III faced Henry Tudor at Bosworth, they were both carrying the DNA of the girl who had been besieged at Leeds Castle. The administrative cruelty of Edward II had inadvertently forged a matriarch who would become the common ancestor of the rival houses of York and Lancaster. The irony is stark. The king who tried to destroy her family ended up creating the conditions for the birth of the dynasties that would eventually replace the Plantagenets entirely. The story of Elizabeth de Badlesmere is a powerful corrective to the traditional narratives of medieval history, which focus solely on the deeds of men in armor. It reveals the hidden machinery of the era, the marriage markets, the prison ledgers, the property laws, and the sheer grinding endurance required of women. Her life was shaped by documents: the marriage contract of 1316, the attainder of 1322, the restoration of 1327, the papal dispensation of 1335, and the will of 1356. These were the milestones of her existence, the paper trail of a survivor. She navigated a world of extreme violence with the weapons available to her: patience, negotiation, and biological continuity. She converted her trauma into tenure, her imprisonment into influence. As we look back at the 14th century, we must see beyond the battles and the pageantry to the cold stone benches of the Tower and the quiet, desperate calculations of the women who sat upon them. Elizabeth's name may be small in the chronicles, often overshadowed by her famous father or her infamous father-in-law, but her legacy is monumental. She is the silent mother of the English monarchy, the ghost in the machine of the British royal line. Her story is a testament to the fact that survival is the ultimate form of resistance, and that the hand that rocks the cradle or signs the deed truly rules the world.